Hey, it's Andrew here, and welcome to the eCommerce Fuel Podcast, the show dedicated to helping 7- and 8-figure brand owners build incredible businesses and amazing lives. And I was chatting with Sarah Livingston, really smart, analytically minded woman, and I can't remember how it came up, but she said, "Have you talked with Celina Wong?" And I said, "No." And she says, "You have to connect. She's just an incredibly talented, brilliant data analyst and knows this super well." And so I started diving in, and very cool story. Celina is the Senior Director of Analytics and Strategic Insight at TULA Skincare, where she helped build that brand, very sizable brand, largely based on the analytics stack and the analytic data and crunching and the insights that they gleaned from that. And when I think about, my background in e-commerce and online, when I think about most of the store owners that we have listening, the topic of analytics comes up very rarely. Usually it's like, oh, Google Analytics 4, what a hack job. We got to figure this out. We need to set it up. And you want to set it up so that you don't lose the data, but then you set it up, it's collecting all the data, and then you promptly go on to doing all the other things, ignoring the data that you're collecting. And that's kind of, I think, the MO of almost all the brands listening. Even larger brands, even 20, 30, $40 million brands often do this. So I'm very excited to have Celina here because analytics has been a core competency for her, where she's used it to really change the trajectory of these brands. Celina, you were mentioning to me earlier in the pre-interview that one of the things that Procter Gamble mentioned or cited when they bought the company was, hey, the analytics stack and the strategy here was really good. Like, this is something that was part of the decision process there. So anyway, I'm excited to dive into all of this and a lot of other things. So thank you for coming on and talking.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited to be here. And honestly, it's an honor to follow all these amazing speakers you've had. And of course, Sarah's way too kind, with her words of my capabilities. But I'm very excited to join you today.
And so we're going to get serious. We're going to talk about analytics and all these things, but like the analytics elephant in the room, I have to mention, and probably a good lighthearted place to start, Google Analytics 4. I'm guessing that's probably not your go-to analytics. Maybe it is. We'll find out in your tech stack. But two things, I can guarantee you that almost everyone listening isn't using analytics well. I can also guarantee you almost everyone listening that is aware of this is like, what was Google thinking when they released this hack job GA4 platform? Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, is it as bad as people say? Because I think most people are saying that, myself included. Don't have the background you do. We haven't dove in and really tried to play with it as much. Thoughts on the GA4 release? Is it as bad as it looks? And what was that thought process there?
I wish I had a magic 8 ball to tell you what Google was thinking. But honestly, it has been a difficult transition, right? In many ways, even a year ago when we knew this was happening, I had the team set out to take a look at what's going on, right? Like, what's the data behind the scenes? How are you going to recreate the reports that the business needs? And so at Tula, we have already pulled in the data into our Techstack and exposed it in our BI tool. And today, we're using the BI tool to report on it versus having team members go into GA even before it became GA4. Honestly, I've heard from folks outside of the Tula space talk about GA4. And if they didn't have that data pulled in, they're scratching their heads going, how am I recreating the same report? Because what happened is the underlying data structure between what you had with GA before and now GA4 are completely different architectures. So that's why a lot of the reports you're creating are very difficult to just duplicate, right? And we spent a lot of time internally trying to recreate the pipeline for pulling in the data because they've just reoriented the way that they think about, calculating basic metrics. And so they've gone from this like user session base all the way to events base. And so if you think about that, the underlying data structure is totally different. So for those of you listening out there going, yeah, I'm the one scratching my head, that's what's happening behind the scenes.
So are you using, it sounds like you're using GA to are you even using GA to collect any kind of data, or is it a meaningful part of your analytics tech stack right now, or are you using other things? We'll dive into your tech stack.
Sure. Yeah. It's still a very meaningful part, right? It's still, even though they switched to more events-based data, it's still very meaningful because it's still tracking sessions, right? It's still tracking at the event level all the tagging work that we've done. It's still tracking that, and we're using it to bring it into our systems to ensure that you can still get your results from your A/B test, right? So, or even like what was our session yesterday and calculating your conversion rate. So still very essential. It's just a matter of users are not going into GA4's interface and using the reports there. We've pulled that data into our own ecosystem and used our own, I know we're going to dive into it, but into our own BI tool to allow users to see what's going on.
Got it. I asked you at the beginning, like, what's one of the things that we need to really cover, or something that you think is just crucial not to miss? I kind of touched on it already, but I kind of, roasted all of us apart from yourself, who's got this pretty well dialed about how we look at analytics as just a secondary or even tertiary issue in our business if we're lucky. And your answer was like, this is like a foundational element to building a meaningful business that can scale. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like why it's so important for people? And then also as a secondary question, like when does it start to make sense to do this? So, most of the people listening, again, let's say your average size business is 5 million in sales. Maybe you've got 7 or 8 or 9 people, meaningfully sized team, but a full-time, well-comped hire for a great analytics person. That's 10%-ish of your payroll, maybe more, probably more, is a meaningful investment. So when does it make sense? When does the investment in a full-time person for this that can really focus on this start to make sense from a business side? So why it's important, and then when people should think about really dedicating resources
Absolutely. I've been data hire number 1 3 times at 3 different startups. So I've made my mistakes. I've seen businesses, choose different routes. And, the third time around, I'm like, oh, okay, here's why it's foundational, right? The first time around, I've seen other businesses do this and then also come for advice is we go ahead and, to your point, it's very expensive, and you go and hire the analysts that might be 2-3 years out of school, perhaps, right? You're like, great, you seem to know some SQL, you're great with Excel, help me take all these different sources and put them together into something meaningful. It can only get you so far. And ultimately, and hopefully, your business continues to scale and becomes extremely successful. And guess what? You're going to ask for more and more metrics. And what ends up happening is that the foundation that wasn't set properly, because in the beginning you were just clobbering things together, didn't have that set foundation of, in the future, we're going to need X, right? And so having someone who has experience, right? And getting into like, when do you actually look for that person, whether it's internal or external help, right? Matters, because you're able to then get into those metrics when the time comes versus, I'm sorry, I have to refactor our data warehouse, or I have to restructure this because I didn't realize that this was going to happen. And that takes time. So if you have someone who just isn't experienced, they may take 2 months to rebuild something, right? And honestly, when you're running a business, you don't have 2 months to wait for something, right? And so that's what I've seen, over my years of working in the startup space and seeing how hiring a data hire number 1 who doesn't have the experience, and that includes me, right? In my very first job at a startup, you were startup-y, right? You were scrappy. You're like, all right, I'm just going to do this. And along the way, you learn, actually, I wish I did it differently. And with the second and third time, I did do it differently. And it led to success and bigger success.
Yeah. Where do you think, for someone who's, you've been doing this a long time, where is maybe someone who's going to make their first hire? They don't need someone who's been doing this maybe for an extended period of time, but they need that like Goldilocks amount, right? Like not too much, not too little, someone who's got experience, but I don't need someone maybe who can manage a team of 20 people on analytics front. What is like a good experience? Let's say someone with 3 to 5 years of experience analytics hire start for? Like what would someone expect to pay, and where's the best place to find someone like that?
Yeah. I think to answer your question, and then actually going back to your last question around like, when do you actually hire for someone? Because that's been a question that has come up organically where a friend of a friend says, can you talk to so-and-so? They're trying to figure this out. And I've tried to give advice there. I think that on answering your first question around someone with 3 to 5 years of experience, how much would you pay them? It really depends on if you're hiring a data analyst or if you're hiring a data engineer, right? And in this world, they have different skill sets. So a data analyst may only be the one that knows how to build you a report, right, in a BI tool, or maybe they're doing in Excel, right? A data engineer is the one who's setting the foundation of, I have all these different sources, right? And maybe at your stage, you've got 10 different sources or even 5, right? And you're trying to bring in, your various POS systems, and you're joining that to your GA, and you're trying to figure out, how are my customers coming to my site or buying my product? That's a data engineer. And their data engineers' salaries versus data analyst salaries are quite different, especially even at the 3 to 5 year range of experience. And I think, leading to the question of, when do I bring someone in? I would say that when you are, say, 5 million, 10 million range, you should potentially consider what we call like a fractional data team, right? So think about your data consultancies out there where you can pay them, but you don't need them on your payroll, right? Where you can flex up and flex down. And they're run by folks that have had experience. And so they can help you out where you don't need to feel that pressure of signing someone on. But I think that once you get past that, right, once you start hitting, oh, I'm going to see 15, 20 million, and you're going to see that scale start to kick up, that's when you're going to see the nuance of your business logic kicks in. And that's when you should consider bringing someone in-house, because the more nuanced your business is, the more you need someone to be close to your business, because they can catch, oh, I know to filter out, this period of time when perhaps you had a spike in fraud, right? And you need to clean that data because it's not real business results. But before then, to your point, there's a cost associated with it. And there's also, well, do I really need this? Like, should I really be bogging down my cash with this? You might want to consider, unless you're a data product yourself, you might want to consider external help first and then moving into internal resources.
Yeah, because at a certain stage, if you're early on, the momentum is more important, and then past that, the optimization and the data insights really start paying for themselves with hires and consultants. I'd say most of the people listening are probably going to be on that $5 million ish or lower. I definitely have a number of members in the 8-figure range, but it's the majority of our audience is probably below that size. Putting on your hat in your earlier days, let's say let's say someone's doing 5 million sales, team of 10, e-commerce product-based business. What would be, and let's say they have $25,000 ish in terms of time, energy, money. It's a really rough proxy to focus, or even $50,000 to focus on data and data analytics. What would be the 2 or 3 things you would really do? And maybe it's reports and GA you're looking at. Maybe it's you hire someone who's really good at this. Where would you focus, given that you have to be so intentional with the money you have at that size? Where would you focus that laser in those circumstances?
Yeah, I think of 2 options. One is that you are going to go out and try to find that unicorn, right? Or whatever nowadays we're calling it, one level less than a unicorn, but someone who's got that Excel skill set, right? Or they know GA pretty well, and let's say you're in Shopify or whatnot, and understand how to pull data from those different sources and what is the join between those different sources. And they might be able to get you something in Excel. And at that point, you do get by, right? Because to your point, you got to be laser focused. And all you need to know is, let's say you've got, 5 SKUs or 10 SKUs, and of those, you happen to know that 3 of them are really driving your success, and you need to know what campaigns are driving them, right? Because you got to dial it up. Maybe that's going to help. But you might also face, well, how do I filter for those candidates, right? So that takes time. And then option 2 is, of course, going out and finding who's my right, data partner. And those are agencies, consultancies, right? And I would say like look for data consultancies. I know there are a lot of marketing consultancies out there as well, but definitely when you think about external options, and you interview those folks, because you should definitely interview them for, what is their background, what is their story, have they been in businesses that you are now operating in? Because it's tough if someone's like, I just spun up an agency and all I've ever done is B2B, and you are a D2C company. Chances are they're not going to understand your business very well, right? So it's really important to understand, well, are the folks that I'm giving this work to gonna, have a leg up, right? Compared to if I was to spend the time to go hire someone else to teach them about my business. So that's a bit of the trade-off, I would say, is can you borrow time with external resources?
So probably look for an agency that's vetted, qualified, has experience with your type of business. Where would you? There's so many places with data you can look at. You can use it, and we're going to get into this with kind of what you have used it for TULA and other brands. Where you can see the outsized returns on data insights at that 5 million-ish or below stage? Is it, you mentioned tracking your marketing campaigns, what marketing campaigns are working? Is it forecasting inventory? Like there's a lot of areas you could try to analyze. It could be conversion rate optimization on site. Where would you, if there's one place you could focus, again, that very limited laser that only lasts for 10 minutes a day, what area would it be?
Yeah, I think another way to also think about it is how are you communicating with customers, right? Like, because that laser focus, I think, really depends on where your business has the biggest pain point. Example, let's say your marketing's doing really well. I know it's never the case. There's always room for improvement. But let's say you've gone viral, right, on TikTok, and people are coming and you're like, great, it's TikTok. That means, well, if I'm going to say, oh, it's marketing, then it's not really the case you should be focused on, right? You're now laser focused on fulfillment and pleasing the customers who've now trust your brand, right? So you have to laser focus on, well, what's my SLA? Like, what's fulfillment like? Because, you know, I would guess 10 out of 10, it's some 3PL that you're working with, and you have to ensure that your inventory is getting delivered to the customer in a timely manner. On the flip side, my answer would be marketing. If you're not finding traction, right? At that point, you're like, well, what's my SEO strategy? What am I doing on Google Ads? Like, how are people finding my products? And so, in many ways, I start with listen to the customer, right? Have you done any surveys? Have you done any focus groups? Even if they're small, these are your most loyal customers at this point, right? And so, what is it that they're telling you that you're then going, I should hone in and find out? If it's conversion rate, that's a problem. Maybe it's your site design, right? Maybe it's your CTA. And, hopefully you have great marketing campaigns and it ends up being fulfillment's a problem, right? Or customer service, right? Because people need to know where their orders are or how to use your product. So I know people don't like the word depends, but I think depends can be answered by, well, what's the customer telling you? And then reverse engineering into that.
Yeah, and that's the biggest pain point. I slightly disjointed, but we were talking earlier, and you had mentioned that earlier in your career, you kind of had this this kind of inflection point, or at least two paths you could have taken. One going down the finance path, and then one going down the data analytics and that path. And I thought that was a really interesting anecdote, and your rationale behind it was interesting. Can you talk just a little bit about that? Why you chose data over finance?
Back in the day when I was in school, not many people studied data like they do, nowadays. I think the only folks who study data were computer science majors, and I was not one of them. And so I started out my career in finance, right? And like, I got to pay my student loans back. And doing so, I also wanted to understand, well, how do I read into the business's health, right? And what better way than to think about it from the corporate finance lens, learn how the best, Fortune 50 companies do it. And I came to a fork in the road where I actually went out and remember when folks were, and they probably still are, doing some general assembly classes out there, right? And I went to one as an info session. And I considered, do I continue down the path of finance? Do I potentially move into performance marketing because I'm quite analytical? Or do I consider data, right? What's this new thing about data? and data's really blown up in the last, I would say, 6 to 7 years. So this was probably 8, 9 years ago when I had joined this info session. And the instructor had told me, guess what? In the future, your CMOs will be data people. And I took that advice and ran with it. And that's how I pivoted my career into data and left the finance world and didn't march down the performance marketing route.
Makes a ton of sense. I'm tempted to ask all the different things you use data for. Like we could talk like inventory forecasting, running sales, customer targeting, product development. There's almost nothing in your business you couldn't apply a data-driven and a data insight approach to. But I think instead what might be more helpful is you have done this. You've come into organizations 3 times, built a data framework, and used it to grow, improve, and in at least this last case, sell the business to a national brand. I'd love to have you walk through kind of that process and what that looked like. Like, what did you do when maybe we can start there. What did you do when you first came into those organizations? And maybe you can give us a sense of the size of them. But what were your first priorities coming in without anyone having taken a lead in data in the past?
Yeah. So going, on the size of the company, each company I've joined was at a point where the first 2 startups were at about 100, 130 people. And then TULA, I was employee 28, I believe. So it was the smallest company I had joined and set the foundation for. And the first thing I did walking into the business, and of course I learned as I went of like what worked and what didn't work, but it was to understand the P&L. I wanted to understand, what are the top 3 revenue drivers and what are the top 3 cost items on your P&L? Because if I knew what was driving the biggest impact in your business, then I want to understand, do you have enough data today to make an informed decision? Or is this a big pain point? And should I dig into this topic, right? And I would say like startups of this size and the folks in the audience, like you're thinking about your top line. Yes, you worry about your bottom line, but you're thinking, how do I grow this top line, right? And so more often than not, I'm asked to dive into a revenue line and think about, well, amongst the revenue line, what are your sales channels, right? And in those sales channels, what are the sub channels? Are any of those big pieces of the pie that don't have clear data? Dig in there, find out what's wrong, right? Or find out what's going right. And then draw those insights and feed it back to the team for, well, what's the strategy here? And move on to the next topic, right? And tackle the business in that sense, right? Like oftentimes you'll find people, boiling the ocean. They're like, well, just tell me any insight. But really, you have to ask yourselves, what's going to make the biggest impact with limited time?
And can you give us an anecdote or two? You don't have to share company names, of course, but what were some of the things that you saw when you dove into the revenue, when you dove into the costs, where diving in, if you didn't have the data, I'm sure you kind of set up a framework for collecting that. But once you started looking at the big costs and the big revenue drivers, with the insights that you gleaned from data over time, what were some of the changes you were able to affect to improve the business?
We have a subscription program or auto delivery program, actually here at TULA. And it was one of my very first projects, amongst the very first projects that I dove into. So the program was running, and when you're a small business, you turn on programs and you're like, this seems like a great idea. Customers we're gaining traction. It's working, but I'm going to focus on something else because the program's working. But no one, at the time was focused on, well, how many items are people subscribing to? What is our churn rate from this program? Are there particular products that are churning more than others? Which ones do we have more subscribers for, right? We were offering a gift with purchase at the time. Guess what? That's a cost, right? And also an operational headache. And I dove into, well, if you gave them GWP, did it make a difference? Did they come back and buy that product, or are you just giving away product to give away product and add more work to your ops team and your warehouse? And so with data, I was able to dig into the fact that we did not have capabilities to make that gift with purchase a more intelligent gift, right? Meaning we were able to see, what did you subscribe to? What could we upsell or cross sell you into? So at the time, we didn't have that capability. And when I looked at the data and ran the analysis, turns out people were not coming back for the product we were gifting. So before I dug into it, we just assumed people like gifts, right? And afterwards I said, guess what? People are not coming back for that product, regardless of you gifting them. It's extra cogs that you're throwing into the box. Your ops team is complaining because they have to throw an extra item in, right? They're packing something extra and it's not making a difference to the customer. And so we decided to also run a survey at the time, right? And ask the customer, when you sign up for this program and you're happy with it, right? One, are you happy with it is another question. But does gift with purchase drive your decision? And we actually found out it didn't drive their decision and it didn't drive retention for the program. So with that analysis and then the strategy of let's go ask the customer, we decided to stop that and save ourselves some money and refocus that money back into, well, how do we get more people into recurring revenue, right? Predictable revenue, which is what many folks are trying to do. And we were also able to change up how we thought about cancellations, because with subscription programs out there, I'm sure there are listeners that are running subscription programs. You often think about, well, how do I save this individual? So diving into cancellation reasons, and if a majority of it is, I just, have too much of the product, how do you think about delaying that cancellation? If they don't like the product, how do you think about letting them swap their product so they can try something different, and not letting them completely walk out the door? And then also, I would say the last most impactful insight was that we found out, customers who subscribed to the program, their lifetime value was over 3x of the average customer. And at that point, it signals to you, oh my God, we got to get more people in this program if they don't know about it, right? So, it really turned up the dial of putting more marketing and efforts behind this program. And the program is at a new height today.
Got it. Fascinating. What you came in, you did that, kind of looked at the low hanging fruit, to use the super overused term. When you'd been there for a while, what were some of the more advanced things that you did beyond looking at the big revenue drivers and the big cost centers or cost areas that gave you, that were kind of more sophisticated, took a little longer, but still were pretty important, kind of in that intermediate phase?
I can think of two things. One is around forecasting, which many business owners, whether you're just starting out or you're extremely advanced, you have to do some level of forecasting to understand what to expect out of your business. So we were doing what most people were doing, which is, let's look at month over month, right? And in a small business, you're like, all right, let's see what's going on. And maybe this promotion is going to drive an uptick of 15% in my next month's orders. And so that was an area where, with my finance background, we were able to advance that area actually with more Python models. And so this is where data, you start thinking about data resources and whatnot. But we were using more advanced data science to help us forecast our e-commerce business, both our D2C and Amazon business. And so we got it to a point where our forecasts variance was within 5%, which is a huge win because in our landscape, things have changed so much. And, of course, I would caveat that 5% did not exist when the pandemic hit because everybody got flipped upside down. But we got out of that and we were able to hit 5% variance, which, helps business leaders understand, well, with the latest, actuals, where are we running today? How do we make changes? How do we spend more then to hit our targets? Okay, if profitability is an issue, then should we dial down our revenue projection, right? And communicate that. So, and trusting the data that this is what we think we're going to land at was so important to the business to be able to understand, should I dial spend up or should I dial spend down? And where should we be doubling down our investments to reach our revenue goals? Or should we communicate, hey, we're not going to hit that goal because we're trying to protect profitability?
Is there a good way for brands to be able to do this if they are, again, in that $5 million range? Like you talked about Python. Python's for those who don't know, like it's a programming language. It's really adept at dealing with statistics and data and modeling and things like that. I would bet the number of e-commerce store owners that have someone on their team that can run Python is very low, right? Of course. And I found it like forecasting is important, cash flow forecasting is important, revenue forecasting for a lot of different reasons. But people have no idea how to do that. So short of bringing someone in, which again is probably something that happens above that 5 million threshold, what's the best way for people to do that? I know on a cash flow model, of course, you can kind of get a 13-week model and kind of on Excel and go through that. But any other tips for people who are doing this with a leaner team that might be able to get some of those benefits without the full-time hire?
I think that there is the easy route and then there's the harder route, right? And it just depends on your flexibility and how much you can afford. To your point, it's a small team. So I've seen in the data industry, I've actually seen quite a few tools out there starting to build out these forecasting capabilities for smaller brands. And so, of course, there's pricing related to that, which I don't have top of mind, but it's for folks to go out there and know that those tools are starting to come up on the scene. And then the harder way, I say the harder way because it's up to you to pull that data, right? And when you think about, how do I get more sophisticated without needing Python, right? It's getting down to a deeper level of what are your drivers of the business. And when I say drivers, it's not even, what's my conversion rate? I'm talking all the way down to what campaigns are you paying for today? If you're advertising, let's say via Meta, right? Or Google Ads, which I'm sure everyone's turning on something and going, all right, let's get ourselves out there, dig into those and into the ad content level, right? Like you're going to get that data and say to yourself, well, how much did that campaign drive, right? And are we going to put more money in? And every time we put $1 in, what is the return? What's the ROAS on that campaign? You can get down to that level. Again, it's the harder way because it involves your time, right? And you know your business better than anyone else because you're going to be the one putting the dollar in. So you could get deeper at that level. It involves your time. And so it's always a trade-off of time or money, right? If you think you can dedicate the time or have someone dedicate the time, I would do it that way internally. And if you have a bit of money and you're like forecasting is really important, be on the lookout for tools or even consultancies that like have these expertise because they can save you the time and they can lend you their expertise in it.
I'd love to talk Techstack, and I'd take it in maybe two chunks. One, let's start with if you were a $5 million brand, what the Techstack you would put together would be. And you alluded to some of the tools that are out there. Maybe you can name some of your favorites. Like what's a basic tech stack for a smaller team that needs to be more nimble and doesn't have the resources for a full-time hire? And then I'd love to hear the tech stack that you have at TULA and really what, once you grow, once you have the resources, or once you're just brave enough to make the leap and knowing that if you do it right, the data investment will pay off. What does that look like when you're really playing at a bigger level and the cool stuff you can do? So maybe we can start with the tech stack for the smaller $5 million brand. What's like the essential tech stack for e-commerce brand?
Yeah, I think I'll talk bare bones and then maybe one level up where I could see, these are smaller companies you could afford. And then where we're at TULA, at the bare bones, I would say, I've seen folks take their data sources. And when I say data sources, I'm sure most of you have gone out there and found out, how do I find the download button in every single one of my tools, right? And then you're going, all right, well, there's an email here and an email here, and I can do my VLOOKUP and find my reporting for how much revenue I've driven, right? And here's my traffic and here's my conversion rate. Fantastic. You kind of know where you're at. And then you're like, then what? And I would say one level above that of the then what, you can look into tools like, in the data world, we call it ETL, and ETL means extract the data from your silo sources.
Mm-hmm.
L, T is for transformation, but before you transform, the L is to load the data somewhere, and then T is transforming it. So transforming just means, for all of you who see the raw sources, you're probably doing some manipulation, some cleanup, right? You're recategorizing things because it just wasn't named properly, let's say, in the system, or you're just like rolling things up because there's way too much data, right? And so that's what transformation simply boils down to, is you're making it more readable and understandable for you. And so there are some, I would say these tools are smaller companies, so they're more willing to work with you. But Portable.io is one of those in the market that are going after Fivetran, which is what we use to extract data and load it into our data warehouse. And so Portable can also push it into data warehouse. And when it comes to being a small business, you're like, well, what data warehouse can I afford, right? Data warehouses are charging at a variable rate. So if you don't have a lot of data, which if you're under 5 million or at that mark, it's actually going to be quite affordable for you because it's a pay per, credit usage, which is the number of rows that you have. And so there are data warehouses. Snowflake's the big one in the industry, but there are upcoming folks that are called Databricks. And so, I mention these tools because they're the ones that are up and coming. And oftentimes, the Snowflakes of the world, they came from that space, right? At one point in time where it was more affordable for smaller brands. So I think that when you look at what are the younger brands out there that can be more affordable to you, I think of the ones that are the rising stars in the space, right? And not necessarily the superstars in the space because you don't need them quite yet. And then there are a few BI tools that are free options out there too.
You mentioned for the data warehouse, Portable.io, and then Snowflake's the big player, but you said Databricks. Was that an actual company or was that just a term?
Databricks is an actual company.
Okay. And when you say, we'll talk about BI tools in just a second here. When you say a data warehouse, it's a term I have heard. I think a lot of people have heard. You can get a guess what it means, right? Like, name's pretty intuitive. Put all your data in here. It's organized. What is it actually? How does it actually work? Can you give a use case for, like, let's say, would you take all of your, I don't know, I'm not even going to try it. Like, how would you use one to get data insights? And is it something that is approachable for someone how approachable is it if you don't have a data background?
The short answer is it's not approachable for someone who doesn't have a data background, unfortunately. And you do need someone, right, internal or external, to help you set it up, right? And this is where we talk about foundation. And that's why I say it's one level above the bare bones, because this is where you start to build that foundation for your house, right? Otherwise, I think I said to you, Andrew, that you're building a Jenga tower, right? When you don't have foundation, you're building a Jenga tower for your data. And at some point it comes crashing down and it's going to hurt. So, when I think about tools like this, like using a tool like Portable, or we're using Fivetran today, internally at TULA, they are actually taking the developer work out of APIs, right? And APIs are essentially connectors between one system talking to another. Mm-hmm. And so you can actually plug in, your credentials and it will pull data out. Great. You pulled something out and now you got to land it somewhere. It's like if you think about your physical inventory, you just took it off the boat and you got to put it somewhere, right? So same thing with data. You're putting that data in your data warehouse. So not a physical inventory, but a virtual, virtual inventory of data in a data warehouse. And it lands in its raw source. And so in this space is where you start to have to need data resources to transform it to the business logic you need, right? And I know this sounds fancy and whatnot, but as your business grows, the nuances to your business, especially if you pivot, so many of you probably pivot out there, especially as you pivot, there's so much historical context that you're like, wait a minute, someone's asking me about year over year. What did we do last year, right? Oh, but last year we had this big thing where we got to filter out these dates, right, in order to have a true comparable metric. And so you got to think about, okay, well, where am I going to store that logic? And it's really data warehousing and then expressing that to your BI tool so that you, as the listeners, operating the business, go, fantastic. I know this data has been cleaned up. Because how many times have you been sitting there going, well, I don't know because the data is not cleaned. The data is getting cleaned, in this space, right? Which is the data warehouse, and having the resources to do so. But in the bare bones scenario, guess who's doing the transformation? Likely someone who you're like, great, you've got some Excel skill, you're doing it in Excel. But the problem with doing it in Excel or G Sheets is that when you start to grow beyond those 10 people, logic starts to get lost. And then when you're asking for those reports, you're like, who's got the logic? and you're recreating that logic over and over again in some Excel or some G sheet. And at that point, you should really standardize it.
So data warehouse, it's just a database designed for the data, and it really just sits there organized in a way that's designed for that. And then do you use, in order to actually get insights from it and pull from that, is your data warehouse, I'm guessing they're not going to be providing those tools or abilities. Do they provide just an easy framework for someone with Python skills to be able to come in and interpret that? Or do they connect with other BI tools? Or how do you actually get in, like you mentioned and alluded to, and get the insights out of that data?
So you connect a BI tool to it. So most BI tools, all BI tools, if anyone out there says they don't connect to a data warehouse, you should run away. I've never heard that, but they should all connect to a data warehouse. And that's where you start to draw the reports and the insights, right, that the business needs to feel like they're making data-driven decisions. And it's really, we talk a lot about speed to insight. So it's really the speed to insight at that point that when you're probably sitting there asking yourself, why should I build all this? This seems too complicated. Guess what? At the end, as an end user, you're getting the speed to insight, right? Versus, oh no, I got to go find out my conversion rate. Well, think to yourself how much time the last time you tried to pull something like that by yourself was.
So it sounds like just a very leveling up from Google Analytics, or at least the good old one we used to have. So correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds like you could take, if you set it up properly and went through the work of creating this infrastructure foundation, you could take all your data, dump it into a data warehouse, and you could say hey, I'd love to know how conversion rate varies based on customer location. I'd love to know how conversion rate varies based on time of day. I'd love to know what are the, if people have bought these two things in the past, or they have these two things in their cart, what's the likelihood they're going to convert compared to all the other times? And if you have the right tech stack, you can start asking these questions, and that gives you the framework for asking them with these tools. Am I thinking about this right?
Yeah. And when you were actually asking me about what advancements you've made, the product affinity you just talked about was one of the advancements we made. So when we launched a new product, and I'm sure, as you're launching products, you're thinking, okay, who's the right target audience for this? Here's my guess. We've then continued to build, well, who's a lookalike to this, right? Who has bought a product similar to the one that we are going to launch? And then you can actually get yourself a list of customers that you think are the right folks to target, right? If your marketing dollars are limited, you want to be able to be smart with your dollars, right? And so that means, how do I know this is the right audience who's going to convert?
You mentioned some good data warehouse tools. Do you have a favorite BI tool, business intelligence tool, especially for maybe down market for that $10 million? Maybe you can give us one of each if you've got one, entry level and then a more sophisticated.
Yeah, there are a couple of BI tools in the market. So, starting with the one that we're actually using now and more sophisticated. And, honestly, for the audience, their price, it's pricey, but it's when you're there and very successful. But we're currently using Looker. And there are quite a few players entering the space of BI today. So some that are further, down the market and much more price conscious. There's some folks that I've been looking at, such as Sigma. Sigma's built very much with a finance lens or Excel lens in mind. So, maybe this is more friendly for folks that are used to Excel, because you can make those adjustments to your metrics almost as if you're in Excel, except it's a BI tool, and you have visualization. So I thought that was really interesting, and something that I'm also looking into further, because we have finance folks that, of course they're still in Excel, but how do I think about tooling that helps advance their needs?
Have you come across or had much experience with some of the attribution tools that are out there? There's Northbeam, there's Rockerbox, there's Triple Whale, there's a whole number of them, and they focus trying to rebuild that bridge that was lost in attribution with, among other things, like the Apple privacy stuff. So have you had much experience using those tools for kind of gaining data insights? And what are your thoughts on
We are actually on Rockerbox, and we've been a Rockerbox customer for 3-4 years now. And so it's been our multi-touch attribution tool. And it's been extremely helpful in helping us understand our investments. We don't go based on last click. we're looking at our MTA for that understanding. And then I would say, you were talking about North Bream, Triple Whale. There are a couple of other vendors out there that we've started to look at from an MMM lens. And, for those that have been around the e-commerce block quite some time, I think that there is a new wave of MMM. And for those just starting out, the reason why we're looking at MMM is because if you...
What does
Oh,
MMM? Sorry to
sure.
interrupt.
It's
When you say that,
it's a media mix modeling. So media mix modeling in the sense that we're trying to look even beyond the impact of our ad investments, beyond its impact on D2C, right? Like when you invest $1 in your ads, you are likely thinking, okay, they're probably shopping on your .com, they're probably shopping on your Amazon if you have Amazon turned on, and then they're probably shopping at, let's say you're selling at Target, right? And you got that partnership. And you're going to go, well, how much am I generating at Target every time I run this ad? It's a gap. It's a black hole, folks. So we've used MTA, and now we're, on the horizon, we're looking out for MMM, media mix modeling, in its new form. So it's to get kind of scientific and geeky, it's called Bayesian MMM, and I won't go any further because then you're just going to fall asleep. But that's what we're looking into now in terms of measuring. How do I get beyond just, digital measurement? How do I understand that what I'm doing is driving customers to the store? And so I think that's the next phase. I know that Rockerbox is also working on an MMM side of the business, but my message there is when you get to the point of more sophisticated measurement, you have to think about all your tools as a way of triangulating to the truth. I think people want to think there's one source of truth when you think about attribution, but I think of it and I'm under the principle of you got to think about it from a triangulation standpoint, because there is no source of truth when it comes to attribution. You got to think about, how do I take these various tools to get to a middle ground?
How are you leveraging AI right now? I mean, you look at like Code Interpreter on ChatGPT and some of the really cool. I'm excited. I do I do a report for the e-commerce industry, and traditionally the worst part has been all the number crunching and the Excel crunching and being in there and calculating everything out. And I cannot wait the next time I do it to throw it into, obviously with all the PPI taken out, but to throw it in a Code Interpreter and be able to just ask it questions, and it will likely save me 30 to 40 hours of work on this thing, because it's just a solid week that I dedicate to doing this. You got to be careful again, of course, with some of the ways you use it, given it as a LLM, and you got to be sensitive to privacy and training and some other considerations. But how are you using AI, ChatGPT, other things in your data analysis?
The short answer is not much. I've actually been very, very careful and thoughtful about data privacy. As you mentioned, I was at a retail conference recently where, of course, everyone's talking about ChatGPT and AI lately. And what stuck with me was, yes, this is buzzing. And guess what? Governance is so important, right? Like, you don't want to feed it information from your brand and then it spits out copy messaging that goes totally against what you stand for. So I thought a lot about that. Where I have used ChatGPT actually was, we had a family reunion recently, and I needed to come up with a game template of like, what family reunion game should I play? And believe it or not, you can actually ask that of Google Sheets, and it would come up with the template. So for those of you going off to family reunions, you could use it for that. But we actually have not used it for much. Areas where outside of data, we've introduced it and said to the TULA team, this might be a good use case, is for testing copy messaging. There's quite, in many ways, when you ask e-commerce companies after they've, built out multiple departments, where are you facing a roadblock? Many times it's creative. And it's because we're trying to test as fast as possible, but that means you need iterations of creative. And this is where, with governance, of course, you still need a human to review what comes out of it. But we thought this was a great area for our creative team to jump in and get more variations.
Interesting. So in terms of making actually like using Midjourney and being able to like not so much on the Chat GPT side, but more on the actual media photo creative
So
side.
it isn't something that hasn't been, released or whatnot. It's an idea that the team's been brainstorming together. But from a data perspective, we're looking at it from the A/B testing lens, right? We're the team running experimentations and reading those analysis back to the team. And so, of course, the team comes back and says, well, what else do you think we should be doing? And it's really, well, what variations, right? Whether it's imagery or copy content, because you're all going to be scrolling, right? So what copy is going to catch your attention from not scrolling further? And that involves really dynamic content. And honestly, as humans, our brain only goes so far of variations. At that point, I'm on thesaurus.com, right? If I was someone coming up with content. So you could really leverage and think about how do you test, learn, and fail and win faster.
Celina, so you have taken a new role. You've really helped TULA along their journey with the data insights, of course, and then the acquisition. And you got an exciting new chapter. You're going to be going to data culture with their website, datacult.com.
That's right. Correct? Yeah, it's called Data Culture, but the website is datacult.com. And I'm extremely excited for the opportunity. I think that I've learned a lot in my journey, and I'm excited to help other people build their data stack.
Yeah. Can you give people a sense who you're a good, like if somebody's listening, almost everyone listening is under investing in this area. Who are you a good fit for, and what can you help them with at Data Culture?
Absolutely. I think for those folks sitting out there going after this episode, where do I even get started? You would be a great conversation, with Data Culture. And I'd be the first, person to talk to you. And I think even for folks that are not just setting up for the first time, not folks that, don't have anything, if you have something and you're thinking, okay, I think we might need to have an audit and need to clean up, some data hygiene here, you would also be a great candidate for Data Culture because, as we were talking about that Jenga tower analogy, at some point, you probably were just trying your best along the way. And now you realize you found success and you have to just rebuild that foundation for a better future. And you would be great for Data Culture as well.
Great. So datacult.com is the website, which it's pretty cool name, actually. I like that name. So, but Data Culture is the name of the brand. So make sure to reach out if that's something you'd like to learn more about. So Celina, thank you so much. This has been a ton of fun. Hope it's not the last time we chat. And thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.